Sure. All right.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is February the 12th, 2022, and we are continuing the interview of Luke Tripp by Azania Tripp. I am going to put myself on stop video and mute, and it's all yours. Take it away, Azania.
Okay. So, Dad, in 1964, you and four of your friends that were first generation college students were able to travel to Cuba. And through your writings, you said one of the reasons why you wanted to go there was to understand white supremacy and through the Cuban Revolution of like how the disruption had occurred. So can you tell us more about your travels and what led you on this trip?
Okay, as I mentioned before, I and three other Uhuru members, Charles Johnson, Charles Simmons, and General Baker, were all members of a Black student group based in Detroit. We attended Wayne State University, and much of our knowledge about revolution was basically self-taught. There was none of the classes in the university at that point in the 1960s really discussed the revolutionary organizations and their goals and their history. What we heard over the media was basically just hardcore anti-communist propaganda, and they portrayed the revolutionaries and the communists just like they portray fighters today in the 21st century. If you oppose U.S. imperialism, if you oppose white supremacy at home and abroad, you are labeled a terrorist, right? So to be labeled a communist is really to be labeled like an enemy, someone who's out, someone who's anti-democratic, who is basically like an enemy. And so that's why the U.S. government attempted to brand the civil rights movements and all other movements as basically communist led or communist inspired. They even tried to accuse Martin Luther King as being under the influence or control of communists. And it's the communists who are stirring up problems. If Black folks were in the South and all Black people were all satisfied, we were happy being humiliated and degraded on a daily basis. It didn't matter to us. We were still happy. And what happened is white communists came down and stirred these Black folks up. They're all happy until, and they're being manipulated by white folks, because Black folks are a mindless mass of people who don't have any kind of organizational thought in their head, right? And they're just being manipulated by these white subversives. So again, the kind of lies and propaganda that had the effect of making us very, very angry, right? Because it ran counter to our own experience, our own observations, and we knew about based on our own experience and our history, and we were inspired by the revolutionary forces around the globe who were fighting against white supremacy, who was fighting against capitalism, who were fighting against imperialism. And we caught on that vibration, that global vibration. And so much of the literature that we read, and I think during the time of the 60s, I probably read more about the revolutionary struggles in other countries than about Black history, right? I was more aware of some of the revolutionary fighters, in the 60s than I knew about uh, a lot of the revolutionary fighters in Black history, because in high school there were no courses on Black history, so uh, I was not. And during college, I had no courses on Black history. So a little Black history I did know, I had to pick up and read things by myself, right? So I didn't have a really deep rooted knowledge about the Black struggles in the United States. I was very much aware of the Black struggles uh, during the 50s and the 60s, 1950s, 1960s, but not the earlier period. And so going back to what was our motivation and our purpose. And our general purpose was that we wanted to align ourselves, and we wanted to have a firsthand experience and observations of a socialist revolution. And we strongly identified with the Cuban Revolution. Yeah.
So you said that you all were feeling very angry and also inspired. Why did you all choose to go down the path of social justice? Because like anger can manifest in a lot of different ways. Why did you choose your anger, combining your anger and inspiration together into your social justice identity? How did that work for you and your friends, if you know their
Okay, well, when I was, my anger was directed more at the system rather than maybe some other object or target, because I was always, had a very strong work ethic, right? And when I was in, I'll say, for instance, even when I growing up in Inkster before I reached my teens, my friend had a lawnmower, and that's how I earned money in Inkster. I just as in my preteen years growing up, and little odd jobs, because I always, we were poor, and if I had any kind of spending money, I had to earn it. I knew that was the only way I was going to get it. And so when we moved to Detroit, of course, I got a paper out, when I was in the 8th grade. And later in the 9th and 10th grade, I used to work at car washes and bowling alleys, sitting pins. And many of the co-workers, I was usually the youngest one on the work site. And I had these older Black men. And these were men who had been kicked to the curb. And I saw how hard that life was. And I knew that, it was not so much part of their character, but they would, how they were kind of victims of the system. And I knew for periods, our family, when my father lost his job, we were on welfare. When you're on welfare, the system operates in such a way that you become stigmatized, that you become a so-called burden on society, in that, in other words, people try to hide the fact that if they're on welfare, they try to cover that up, because it was, the loss of dignity, the loss of being considered uh, an asset to society. Anyway, so firsthand through my interactions with these older men, some were, good folks, but I see how the system just, dumped them. They had very little education. So that taught me one good lesson. Buddy, if you don't have good education, the system will chew you up. Okay. And so I had a systems orientation, and I knew and then the idea that you have these enormous wealth among folks who own their businesses and corporations, and they care less than a dime about most of the workers. And so that's how I became anti-capitalist, because I see how those who own things and who were owners of, and people who worked for them, how they were treated. So, and then I was anti the US government, because I saw mean the government treated, Black citizens here abroad and what little, and virtually had no respect for people of color outside of the U.S. So
is this experience common towards your friends that you traveled with to Cuba with?
yes, yeah, we are, and that's why we're an organization. That's what drew
Did
us.
you all ever work together before heading to as young people?
Yeah, no, we didn't. We came well with General Ricker and also Charles Simmons. Um, we came together on the campus at Wayne State University. Now, my friend Charles Johnson, I knew him from Inkster when we were in our preterm years, but we lived about a half mile apart, and we were not close friends. We just, we were just in the same room and a classmate. But he was. I remember him as a extremely bright student, probably one of the brightest students in the classroom. So he was kind of a nerdy kind of student, we would say.
So after you all returned to Cuba or returned back to the US from your travels in Cuba, what work was Uhuru doing? And what other organizations were you involved in after Cuba? Because it seems that in your paper you talked a lot about just understanding an international identity of what activism meant. So it seems like you keep fluctuating into different like collectivist frameworks.
Mhm. Well, after we returned from Cuba, Uhuru dissolved, right? And of course, there was one big controversy was that we were an all Black student organization, but one of our members had a white wife, and see the Uhuru, there were two strong tendencies within the group. There was you had people like myself and Charles Johnson, for instance, just to deal with the four, who had a very kind of internationalist, kind of embracing kind of orientation, right? And then you had Charles Simmons and General Baker, who had more of a Black nationalist kind of tendency and organization, right? But all of us were kind of open-minded. So there was another Black nationalist leader of an organization who influenced our organization, and he held the position that one of our members had to be expelled because he was married to a white woman. And I opposed that. Charles Johnson opposed that. Charles Simmons and General Baker kind of went along. They weren't kind of anti-white, but they sort of subscribe to the notion that an all Black organization should not have members who are married to whites, because the white partner in their minds was could be a point of insecurity, right? So it's a matter of trust. And so to have full trust, all those members must be Black. And then it was the other nationalist thing that, so we only had Black members, but we didn't say anything about people's affiliations or their relations with people who were not Black. So they went further, right, beyond that. So otherwise, but up until that point, there was not a major issue, with that. And then later on, when we formed DRUM in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, well, that issue came up again, but I guess, it did not, it was not defined that way. People who had relationships with people outside who were non-Black were maintaining their membership and held very high positions. So it served to split Uhuru, but it did not split the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Okay.
So, since so using political frameworks that also influence romantic relationships, can you tell me a little bit about the proposed like gender role politics that you saw within your friend groups of how that worked? What was the perceived role of like a Black man and the perceived role of a Black woman? So what were those archetypes that these people that identified as nationalists and with this theory that
Mhm.
creating, I don't know if it would be like Black love or Black building
Mhm.
a stronger Black community through romantic
Okay.
relationships.
Well, the Black nationalist a tendency is highly hyper masculine. All right. That's one thing about Black nationalist groups. They're highly hyper masculine. They believe in kings and queens. You know, the king is the king of the house and his queen is his partner and all that. Yeah. So it's very patriarchal, right? And you see many of the Black nationalist groups now is highly critical of like the Black Lives Matter movement and all because uh, they are critical of Black women, particularly Black queer women, right? Because the Black nationalists also uh, kind of strong homophobic tendency. So they're really kind of rooted in uh, hyper masculinity and, very biased against homosexuals, queers, and all that sort of thing, right? Yes. So, that's one of the very backward characteristics of the Black nationalist movement overall. And well, they have some progressive aspects, but they're very backward. And then see so the Black movement has both of these internationalist, socialist, interracial aspects, and they have these Black nationalist aspects. And usually, there tends to be a great deal of tension between these two tendencies. Right?
So when you all were in Cuba, since you're saying that like you were traveling with people that maybe identified it within this functionality of hypermasculinity through this nationalist identity, and also like yourself, how were you able to, I guess, be in space knowing that maybe not all of your ethical like practices are embedded in the organization. So if you're part of Uhuru, but then there are people that are practicing homophobic views that don't align with you, how were you able to practice your social justice work, knowing that maybe that wasn't always the collective of people that were in space?
Mhm.
Since like
Well,
you had that tension a little bit like in drum and you were able to be sustainable, how were
mhm,
you able to be sustainable on that?
mhm. All right. Well, as you grow with experience and wisdom, you know that all groups have some degree of heterogeneity. In other words, whenever you form a group, uh, there's not going to be complete uniformity. And that lack of uniformity has to do with the nature of human beings, period. Right? If you just have a couple, you know, they may be girlfriend and boyfriend, or husband and wife, but they don't agree on everything. They have different kind of opinions and attitudes and all that. So the larger the group, the more diversity in opinions and values you have. And then so you have to figure out a way to make it workable and come upon agreed upon goals, agreed upon rules on what you're going to get. Because many of members of the Uhuru, I mean, many of us, we didn't go to the same parties. We didn't kind of socialize with people at different levels. It depends upon our orientations, you know. So some members, but most of our work was political work. So we were basically on a general common experience and a focus for political work. For instance, one of the reasons why we had earlier student formations on the campus, and we did have uh, racially mixed group, but those organizations were kind of weak. We wouldn't make it stronger if it's all Black, because the white members would bring up some extraneous stuff that take us off of the goal of fighting against racial oppression and Black oppression. And what we bring is our experience in this daily kind of humiliation, which the white members are not, don't bring to it. They bring maybe an agreement on some of the goals that racism is bad and segregation, all that sort of thing, right? And so when you want, so to gain greater cohesion, right, and great and less friction around some of these political goals, then you try to make the group more homogeneous. And that works with almost any group. You know, suppose you had a group of males and females. And so, okay, they agree on a lot of things, but maybe a lot of women will bring up these issues that the males won't bring up. And the males may not want to invest that much time and energy dealing with some of those highest priorities among the women. And if just like you bring, you know, like cis people with queer people, there's got to be some issues. They agree on a lot of things, but they know that basically you form alliances or coalitions, but you know, you need your own group to stay sharply focused, because the other groups, members who don't share that experience are gonna take discussions in a different direction. That you know. So, and then it leads to a lot of frustration. People are attending me, oh, I wasted a whole hour listening to that. Why aren't we talking about this? So if you want to eliminate that, the point here is that, well, for me and others, I joined different groups. I'll join a group over here that's talking about that. And I mean, it's not like I'm a single member group, single member. I have a single membership in with just one group. And so that's why a lot of people, just like perhaps yourself, you're a member of several groups, depending upon what they're about. So
yeah, so intersectionality is
right.
Yeah, very present.
Right. So the point here is that, you know, just because you're a member of a tight group does not mean that you are in full agreement with the person's values, with their orientation, but you are in agreement to the extent that you have a working relationship and you come up there. And that's why groups, if you're going to be effective, you got to have a set agenda. You can't just let everybody just fly all, you know, go in different directions with the thing. You say, okay, this is the meeting. This is what we're going to discuss. These are the strategies we have to discuss to see if we want to achieve some objectives and goals. And that's what organization looks like. You know, organization looks like things are kind of a structured. Yeah, you have a plan for that meeting. What is your plan for that meeting? And what do you want as an outcome or a takeaway from the meeting? And how does this meeting fit in with future meetings? And how those future meetings relate to a goal? Mm-hmm. So when you're an organization, you begin to systematize things. You can organize things. You sequence things, and you have set of goals for things that you do. So that if things and you try to minimize any kind of discussion that goes off the agenda, that goes off for the purpose of the meeting, right? Mm-hmm.
So when you were planning with your with these other group of Black men going to Cuba, did any of you think about inviting, or were you aware of any other like Black women that wanted to participate in the trip, or was that ever an idea to also be inclusive in that way, to have like a Black woman that was, I don't know if they were any Black women a part of Uhuru at that time that wanted to attend the trip, and since there wasn't that representation, mm-hmm. you able to be thoughtful in your travels?
Okay, that thought never crossed my mind. There were Black women in Uhuru, right? There weren't. So the idea about we had a meeting and say, well, most of the members of Uhuru were Black men, all right, straight away, okay. And most of our discussions did not include women. And that thought never appeared to me and said, maybe we should try to encourage, like a Black woman from our organization to be part of it. That was never part of the discussion, right? That thought never crossed my mind. I don't think it crossed the minds of the other three, right? Because during that time, like the fighters for the revolution, and then see, Black men we have this warrior kind of mentality, right? And so we saw ourselves basically as the warriors. We and is and then see, the leadership is all tied, linked up with masculinity. That's what men do. Men take charge. Men fight, right? And so and the women play a supportive role. So there was coming out of Black culture, and during that time, there was there was strong masculinity operating. A lot of testosterone in all of those organizations.
So what is it like, and not that you can speak for General Baker, but since his daughter has created this center where she is archiving his legacy and the historical impact that he's made, and that she's also trying to be very inclusive and adding as many voices as possible, and that you're a part of it. And that that your daughter, Me, is interviewing you. So you have a lot of Black mixed race women that are descendants of this core performative hyper masculine legacy. What is that like for you, since like that's not how you will be, that we're kind of carrying these names?
Okay. Number one, by the way, in terms of the General Baker Institute, much of that work was done by Carolyn's mother, right? And passed on. And so they said, well, how are we going to institutionalize this history and this experience? And then there were some other people who are very supportive of that. And as you pointed out, that General, you met Charles Simmons, who travels abroad and relates to people of all backgrounds. He stayed with us and all, right? So the members of Uhuru were very open-minded. We weren't narrow nationalists in the first place, okay? And so, and some of the other leaders of Uhuru, like 1, 2, 3, 4, people in the leadership, about 4 or 5, had non-white wives, basically white wives, okay, and all that. So that has never, and then plus you can, and then in the League of Racially Black Workers and all, we had a lot of links with progressive with white groups, right? So we're kind of open. It's just like, well, the Panthers in Oakland, California, right? They had a lot of mixed race folks in supporting their organization. So in terms of like your generation, I mean, the descendants of General Baker, my descendants like you and all those, we basically had a global orientation. And the first foremost, we operated, I think everybody had the mindset of this, basically, progressiveness and revolution, right, does not have a skin color. Hey, comrade. Yeah. So progressiveness and humanity is not enclosed in a colored body, right, of any color, right? So it transcends anybody's physical kind of characteristics. Where's their heart? Where's their spirit? And what is their track record? What are their experience? So, all my friends and all, I always had close friends with different races and nationality. And, I was involved in forming an all Black organization for a purpose. It didn't mean I didn't have white friends. It didn't mean I wouldn't join another organization that's interracial, right? But I'm not like a one pony act, okay? Because I know that there's various ways that you can address them. If all of those organizations are about basically improving the human condition and fighting against oppression, whatever the form is, whether it's capitalism, whether it's racism, whether it's colorism, anything like that, hey, there's got to be, that's got to be fought against. And you got to have some, well, what do you want? We want a humane society.
So when you were in Cuba, did you feel like you saw that diversity, that kind of that liberal space that you wanted to explore when you're in Cuba, just seeing this
Well,
revolution within
mhm,
this very
mhm.
liquid intersectionality, diversity and stuff. So
Well, absolutely, because Cuba became Cuba provided the space for all the revolutionary forces to come together, right? And so we had the fighters from Africa, the various nations of Africa, or colonies from Africa, and from Asia, from Latin America. So we had the rainbow there. That's what Cuba stood for. And so the kind of society that we were all fighting for in bringing all these, like the rainbow, the progressive and revolutionary rainbow together on Cuba. So all the revolutionaries many of them came to Cuba, and Cuba provided that space. And so that's the kind of world we wanted to build and fight for, one where all of these different groups from different nationalities, different so-called races and all that sort of thing come together and say, we got to struggle against imperialism, we got to struggle against capitalism, we got to struggle against militarism, and we got to struggle against racism, right? So everybody is on board with that. And then you got to figure out how you're going to do it. Right? So at that point, how we were going to do it is we were going to build a Black political vehicle that would unite that Black community. It didn't mean we wanted only a exclusively Black nation. That we weren't Black nationalists like that. Right? We were Black because that was a basis upon which we were oppressed. We were working class because that was a basis upon which we were oppressed. So you unite on a basis upon which you are oppressed. So if a person is feel oppressed on the basis of being queer, then you unite on that basis. You form a group on that, right? It's just like you're not a member of other groups, and there's other kind of issues that you can address. So many folks who just get into the narrow thing and no, I can't relate those because they're not exactly like me, well, that's very, very narrow. And so we were all very open-minded. And then, of course, as I said before, that given the changing demographics, I mean, the diversity of the country, there are more Latinx folks in America than they are Black folks. And that composition is constantly changing, a large Asian population. So your strategies and the vehicles that you use have to sort of reflect that reality. So people still have their little ethnic Asian groups. You have your little ethnic Black groups. I mean, when you were at on a campus of Augsburg, you have all these different student groups, and sometimes they have a joint thing, sometimes they have separate things, but they also feel the need to have these little separate organizations because there many of the issues are very narrow, and meetings takes a lot of time. So the point here is this: suppose you have a Hmong group and they want to discuss their differences with they want to discuss the differences between their generation and the previous generation and the culture, So maybe a Nigerian groups over here, they may not be that interested in what the Hmongs are doing over here and the kind of issues they're addressing. So Nigerians over here, Ethiopians over here, so people get into those separate groups. That doesn't mean they're isolated from other groups, at least the ones who are very broad-minded and very comprehensive. And so I've always been, I tend to have a very universal perspective and viewpoint on how I approach things. I see that some requires our parochial issues, and maybe so you address them with parochial strategies, okay? But it's just like, because some naive folks, well, we shouldn't even have race-based organizations. Everybody should go, well, some organizations should be based like that, but they're not the only forms. So some people get uptight because this other group it's exclusive in some way. No, leave them alone, right? Okay, because maybe there's maybe they're addressing some things that's none of your business, okay? And they just want to be among themselves to talk about this and hash it out among themselves. So, don't try to deny them their space, And it's only if they scheming and plotting against you, then I think, hey, you got an issue there, okay? Okay, that's when that comes there. So I always find out, instead of jumping and criticizing people in their groups and all that, find out what the deal. Let me count.
So you've talked a lot about community organizing and the importance of, kind of having at least one shared belief, this unification, and then also having the comprehension of the intersectionalities that are also embedded in that group, and that brings a lot of strength. So like that's what I feel like I'm hearing. So since you started being your activist identity started in the early 1960s, going to Cuba in 1964, and thinking now of today, February 12, 2022, living in Minnesota, where we have a lot of high publicity of a lot of Black men being murdered by police. So you're seeing a lot of consistency with the brutality of and the murder of Black men being very consistent. What do you think about that? Like, this is like your life, and the historical moments that you've lived through. So for a lot of young people, these are kind of like hearing about you doing a lot of reading in the early 60s about what was happening in the 40s and 50s, but not a lot of representation. And so you're kind of guiding yourself and creating your own educational pathway, which you've able to be a professor in higher education and be that for other people of traditional, non-traditional learners that are able to access higher ed. And now, again, a lot of historical repetition and a lot of young people living in history, which is very different, I think, for a lot of us. And you've been able to do that repetitively. So I guess, what are your thoughts on your life?
Well, when I reflect on my life, there's some very positive aspects. A lot of those positive aspects are related to the hardships and the struggles, right, that forced me to grow. Okay, so if I had an easy life and I wasn't exposed to a lot of things, of course, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I'm kind of proud to be the person I am today. I'm proud that I have aligned myself with the progressive forces of the world. I'm proud to be the father of you and Comrade and Ruth. Yeah, I'm very proud of my family, very proud of my family's achievement, particularly in the areas of education and what we had to overcome. I feel very blessed. I came from a functional, solid family rooted, taught me discipline, taught me, the meaning and significance of hard work and strong family values. So when I reflect, in one sense, I'm very fortunate to have, that kind of background and those kind of roots, because usually, a lot of youth you see come from dysfunctional families, are not really firmly rooted, and they are very vulnerable to this very vicious, competitive society. It would chew you up. So if you don't have a good foundation coming from strong family, some kind of orientation to keep your they keep you balanced, and I get imbalanced by a lot of these negative forces that are out here, street forces, institutional forces and things like that. To have the wherewithal, they have the inner strength to be resilient and to bounce back, because we all, get knocked down more than once, and have to deal with defeats and setbacks and all. But then, that's the rhythm of life. We all experience, virtually all human beings are going to experience some setbacks and all. And then, but what uh, what kind of foundation do you have? If you don't have a strong foundation, then a crisis can knock you over and really set you back permanently. Okay. So when going back to what is happening now, for instance, like in Minnesota, you mentioned about the whole continuing murder of Black men by the police department, and increasing. And I've seen the increasing militarization of the police department. And right now, in the 60s, internally, the US was not as militarized as it is today. I mean, it is much more militarized. The society itself is much more uptight, and many levels internally is much more dangerous, right? See, when you saw films about civil rights movement, about police dogs being sick on Black folks and police beating people with clubs and all of those other things, say, "Whoa, man, that's really, really bad." Right now, is worse. It's worse because in the 1960s, didn't too many, there wasn't a high, outrageous number of Black folks in prisons and jails. Okay. Right now, it's a huge industry. I mean, you hardly forgot. If you're a Black man in 40 and never been arrested, never been in jail, I think that percentage is really probably about maybe 20% of Black men who get to 40 without being jailed, without being jacked up by the police or something like that, right? Because it becomes just a more common experience. And well, let me tell you a story. My first air flight was in 1964. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, going to the airport. Hey, going to the airport, you can bring your friends, your family, and all that. It was no problem. It's just like going to the bus station. Okay, and then you can take the flight up to the gate, and your family's there in the gate. Go into the concession stands and things like that, and wave your friend from the window. Right? Hey, if you don't have a ticket or flight and ID, you're not going past that gate. All right, only passengers with a ticket is going to get past that gate, and then people with armed forces and all. So the militarization, if you have an experience it's not like pre 9/11, even pre this. It was much more open society, and the police had little cloth uniforms. They weren't walking around like they're in combat, actual shooting wars. But the police and SWAT teams and all of that, hey, these are just indications or sign of the extent of militarization. But people in your generation, you're going, that's the society you were born into, all this security stuff at the airport. Well, you never experienced anything other than that, right? And so they have to put these security measures globally. So no matter where you go, you got to go through a lot of security, especially after 9/11. And so, again, in the number of the types of police units and all, man, they've greatly expanded. Okay. So this is on this environment here is much in many ways is much harsher. And then in the 60s, things were opening up. Black folks were winning voting rights. Black folks were becoming increasingly elected and holding administrative positions in government positions. Right now, you can see what's happening. The conservative, especially Republican Party, all that is trying to minimize the participation of people of color everywhere, using every little device, and trying to roll back in terms of voting rights, in terms of women's rights around abortion, right? And see, at the same time, there are other things, progressive things that are happening too. The progressive things is that there are more people of color that are being elected to positions. There are more people of power involved in those agencies. So what I'm saying is that the picture is all complex. It's not going in all one direction. You know, there's some ups and some down and downs. So you have to really sharpen your skills in terms of how you analyze things. Look at the ups and the downs, and see, like, what's the result, and what are you measuring, and the meaning of those measurements. So the world that we're in today, that's why I always, harper on the importance of education, the importance of mental development. If you want to be a survivor, well, you better invest heavily in the brain. Okay, that's the world. I mean, so this world is not made for dummies. Dummies gonna kick. Dummies are gonna be thrown under the bus. So you better be able to figure out something in order to navigate in a very hostile society, because America is very, very hostile, especially for people with low incomes and have no money. And you know that. No money, no health care. Well, man, yeah, I mean, you're out in the streets. And it operates on your ability to pay for goods and services. If you don't have the ability to pay for goods and services, buddy, you're going to be thrown under the bus. That's lessons, regardless of your color. That's lesson number one.
Okay, I want to respect Azania's time.
Okay.
I think, my opinion, I feel like that was the best recording so far, just because
You want to stop recording right now?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was really good because you talked a lot about like current issues, because it kind of pushes back on your identity a little bit too.